58th Annual ISNA Convention. Reimagine and rebuild with renewed resolve.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you. My name is Muhammad Sanusi. I am the Executive Director for the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers. I am also a board member of the Islamic Society of North America. I would like to welcome you on behalf of ISNA to ISNA 58th Annual Convention Interfaith Session, collaboration between multi-faith communities for the common good. This year convention comes in a very critical time for us as Muslim American communities and for our nation. I am glad that ISNA has chosen the theme for this year convention to reimagine and rebuild with renewed resolve. The challenges that we face today require us to reimagine and rebuild, but not as one community. One community cannot do it. We have to work together with our interfaith communities. ISNA has been, as you all know, in the forefront for the past several decades, leading and building interreligious collaboration, partnership, and relationship. We build those relationships with the largest religious groups in the United States. Together, we made significant strides toward our interreligious partnership and collaborations. As you know, our various interfaith programs conducted with the largest religious groups, like the National Council of Churches, the largest, economical Christian groups in the United States, with the Conference of the Catholic Bishops, and with many other individual denominations. With the Jewish community as well, we work with the Union for Reform Judaism, with the conservative Jews, and with other Jewish communities, and we work with the Buddhists and Hindus and other faith communities. So today's session will highlight some of our joint interfaith initiative that we have been doing together in the past several years. Our speakers today are very familiar with ISNA, and they have been working closely with ISNA for a number of decades. But I really, before I turn it into my panel here, I wanted to highlight one of the initiatives that we worked together, and we did it together to address the pandemic that we all are facing until today. We created an initiative called Faith for Vaccines. It's a national initiative brought together a number of religious groups across the country. The initiative is recognized addressing vaccination issues. We advocate for vaccine access. We advocate for vaccine equity. We advocated for vaccines, uptake, and also addressing hesitancies, because we understand that religious institutions and religious leaders, they have a role to play in advancing vaccinations to save lives here in the United States, and of course to send the same message around the world as well. So this is just to highlight one of the initiatives that we work together as a Muslim community with the interfaith communities, and this is something that's recognized by the Biden administration in a number of ways. So today's panel definitely is going to touch upon some of the initiatives that we have done together in the past several decades, as well as in the past 1 year since our last convention. So now it's really my pleasure to introduce my good friend, Reverend Jim Winkler. Jim serves as the president of the National Council of Churches. Jim, before that, served as the Secretary General of the Church of Society for the Methodist Church. So Jim is not a stranger to the convention. He is one of the closest allies for ISNA. As Jim always says, ISNA and the National Council of Churches are twins. So Jim, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Shalom alaikum. My name is Jim Winkler, and I bring you greetings on behalf of the National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA, where I serve as President and General Secretary. Known as the NCC, the National Council of Churches was founded in 1950. Our predecessor body, the Federal Council of Churches, was founded in 1908 as an expression of the ecumenical movement, the effort to unite churches that were hitherto disconnected. I also want to extend greetings to your President, Mr. Safa Zarzour, and your Executive Director, Mr. Basharat Salim. Thank you for your leadership and your commitment to working together with us. The purpose of the National Council of Churches is to live as a community of communions, called by Christ to visible unity and sent forth in the Spirit to promote God's justice, peace, and the healing of the world. This purpose is served as the communions striving to express unity by living together as the council, to further their vocation to proclaim Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord, to engage in ecumenical worship and in biblical and theological study, to challenge and counsel one another in mutual accountability as a witness to the unity of the church, to share resources for unity and mission, to strive for peace and justice in the social, political, economic order, to practice and advocate careful stewardship of God's creation, to act as responsible servants to people in need, to foster education about and for ecumenism, and to engage in all educational efforts from an ecumenical perspective, to nurture ecumenical life through relationships with regional, national, and world bodies and groups and movements of Christians seeking renewal and unity, to cultivate relationships and dialogue with people of other faiths and ideologies, and to evidence their commitment to racial, gender, and economic justice, as well as in disability and generational concerns. I first began a relationship with the Islamic Society of North America nearly 20 years ago, when I was with the United Methodist Church and served as landlord of the historic United Methodist Building on Capitol Hill, across the street from the Supreme Court and the U.S. Capitol Building. Dr. Saeed approached me to inquire about the possibility of ISNA becoming a tenant in the United Methodist Building, and I readily agreed. It was my view then and now that we must work closely together if we are going to reimagine and rebuild with renewed resolve. That, of course, is the theme of your 58th convention. Meanwhile, the National Council of Churches will hold our own convention virtually this year, and our theme, too, is filled with alliteration. It will be in new wineskins, from pandemics to possibilities to promises. It seems to me that our themes are complementary, and they point to our common emphasis on drowning out divisive language with a message of unrelenting peace and love. This joint commitment is needed now more than ever as we face a global pandemic, rapidly accelerating climate change, resurgent hate groups in our nation, and a growing threat to our democracy. Despite these serious and growing threats, I believe the work we have done together and will continue to do together represent a belief that faith matters, that ideas matter, and that words matter. 2 years ago, I was present in Abu Dhabi when Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Sheikh Ahmed Al-Tayyib, signed a document on human fraternity for world peace and living together, which began with these words: "Faith leads a believer to see in the other a brother or sister to be supported and loved. Through faith in God, who has created the universe, creatures, and all human beings, equal on account of his mercy, believers are called to express this human fraternity by safeguarding creation and the entire universe and supporting all persons, especially the poorest and those most in need." The Grand Imam and the Pope call upon ourselves, upon the leaders of the world as well as the architects of international policy and world economy, to work strenuously to spread the culture of tolerance and of living together in peace, to intervene at the earliest opportunity to stop the shedding of innocent blood and bring an end to wars, conflicts, environmental decay, and the moral and cultural decline that the world is presently experiencing. In my view, if we do not work together to change the course of our nation and our world, we face numerous sorrows. There are warnings before us. Just a few short months ago, a violent mob invaded the United States Capitol on behalf of the defeated president in an attempt to reverse the results of a fair and free election, and with the desire to murder members of Congress and the outgoing vice president. The events of January 6 should never be taken lightly. Even the nation's most senior military officials were concerned Donald Trump would attempt to stage a coup, and we know now that they were prepared to stop him. I've worked across the street from the Capitol for 35 years, and I consider January 6 not only as a warning to us, but one of the saddest days of my life. These same forces are now attempting to restrict the vote in our nation, primarily to those who agree with them. Together, we can work to be a nation committed to the right to vote, to protecting the rights of immigrants, to securing a living wage and health care and education for everyone, to confronting climate change, to eradicating racism, and to being a force for peace and human rights throughout the world. Just this week, I accompanied a group of faith leaders who delivered a letter to leaders of the United States Senate in which we expressed our concern for the well-being of souls and the social health of the nation. In that letter, we recalled that 56 years ago, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. issued a call for clergy to join him for a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. We had already witnessed Bloody Sunday and the brutality of Jim Crow determination to suppress African American votes. This was not simply a political issue, Dr. King insisted, but a moral issue that demanded the attention of faith leaders. More than half a century later, we are saddened to see voter suppression once again adopted as a political strategy. The same lies that were told to incite an insurrection at the Capitol are being repeated in state houses across America as justification for voter suppression measures, not only to make it more difficult for some people to vote, but also make it easier for state legislatures to overturn the results of elections they do not like. These efforts are born of greed and racism. We must protect the infrastructure of our democracy through voting rights, the economic and wage infrastructure of poor and low-wealth people, and the infrastructure of the roads and bridges of our nation. The urgent necessity of these efforts coincides with next week's 20th anniversary of the terror attacks of 9/11. The National Council of Churches remembers the victims of the attack and prays once again that the memory of those who died that day will be eternal. And we again pray for the physical and mental healing of those who are still suffering from related injury. The prophet Jeremiah said, "Heal me, O Lord, and I shall be healed. Save me, and I shall be saved, for you are my praise." The National Council of Churches cannot disregard what has happened in the United States and around the world since that fateful day 20 years ago. The U.S. invaded two nations, Afghanistan and Iraq, and is left with the ruinous aftermath of those wars. The war on terror in Iraq lasted 8 years, and the country remains unstable. The United States war in Afghanistan is only now ending after 20 years, and the future of the Afghan people is in question. The lives lost in those wars, American, Allied, Afghan, and Iraqi, measure in the hundreds of thousands. We pray for the dead, for those who mourn them, and for those left behind to pick up the pieces of their societies. May their memories be a blessing, and their loved ones find comfort. Following September 11th, bigotry and violence aimed at Muslim Americans and Arab immigrants increased in the United States. In response to this spreading hate, the NCC reinvigorated its Muslim-Christian dialogue so that our Muslim sisters and brothers would know that they had friends among their Christian neighbors. This was expanded into interfaith allyship with the Muslim community with the inception of the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign, a coalition that still works to counter anti-Muslim sentiment. The NCC pledges to continue these efforts. The scriptures remind us in the book of Ecclesiastes, "For if they fall, one will lift up the other, but woe to one who is alone and falls and does not have another to help." During the rescue and recovery efforts at Ground Zero, and later the planning and reconstruction of the new One World Trade Center, the U.S. demonstrated a spirit of camaraderie. As we approach the 20th anniversary, we implore our fellow Americans to remember our past goodwill and once again embrace the message of unity as we are faced with divisions in our country. The deadly spread of the COVID-19 virus continues, and our brokenness prevents an end to the pandemic. Anti-immigrant sentiments and policies extend beyond Arabs and Muslims and include refugees and asylum seekers from Mexico, other Latin American countries, and beyond. Anti-black racism, long a part of U.S. history, hit a fever pitch last summer with the murder of George Floyd. And now our cities and states are embroiled in struggles over policing, social and economic welfare, and voting rights. In response to this isolationism, white supremacy and Christian nationalism, which likewise have negatively affected the indigenous as well as the Asian and Pacific Islander communities, the National Council of Churches member churches reiterate our commitment to working together to bring about reconciliation. The contemporary ideology, Christian nationalism, is of great concern to members of the National Council of Churches, and indeed to all Americans who are committed to peace and justice. From the foundation of the United States, Christian nationalism has traditionally employed images that advocate an idealized view of the nation's identity and mission, while deliberately ignoring those persons who have been excluded, exploited, and persecuted, such as Native Americans, enslaved African Americans and their descendants, and a cascading procession of others, including the Irish, the Chinese, the Italians, the Jews, and the Muslims. From its beginnings, the Christian nationalist movement has endorsed American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States is more righteous and upright than other nations. But during the last 60 years, a significant number of Christian nationalists have become increasingly partisan, divisive, ideological, and militant. Christian symbols have been misappropriated, emptied of their profound meaning, and invoked to support idolatrous loyalty to the nation. Christian nationalists claim a dedication to a biblical worldview, but their understanding of that worldview is in multiple ways contrary to the actual witness of the Bible. Where the Bible has as its core the story of a people committed to welcoming aliens and strangers because they themselves were aliens and strangers, and to defending the oppressed because they themselves were oppressed, the Christian nationalist narrative rejects the stranger and judges the oppressed as deserving of their oppression. Where the Bible declares that all human beings are made in the image of God, American Christian nationalists regard only certain people, advanced, white, Christian, English-speaking, to have the full measure of God's image. Where the Great Commandment enjoins us to love God with all our heart, soul, and mind, and our neighbors as ourselves, Christian nationalists choose to narrow who is considered an American, to love only certain neighbors, and to regard others as enemies to be defeated, deported, or destroyed. Where Christ affirmed that my kingdom is not of this world, Christian nationalists have equated the kingdom of God with their vision of America. Many Christian nationalists have also cast their lot with conspiracy theories and falsehoods that serve to create imaginary demons and predators. They conjure plots designed to inspire their followers to aggressive and sometimes violent assaults on people of goodwill who hold a different perspective. By contrast, genuine morality must be rooted in a clear-minded devotion to truth, including an accurate understanding of our history, our failings, as well as our successes. Jesus prayed to God that all may be sanctified by truth. Sanctification comes through a humble, willing submission to the witness of God's Spirit, which in turn enables a bold acknowledgement of the truth. In the United States today, the truth to be acknowledged includes genocide, expansionism, slavery, racism, economic inequality, and the exploitation of our natural resources for the benefit of the few, the injury of many, and climatic peril for all. The alternative to Christian nationalism, however, is not disengagement from politics, but a willingness to work in the public realm and to cross over political, social, economic, and religious boundaries in order to discern and foster the common good for all people in this nation and the world. In accordance with our nation's promise of religious freedom and its practice of religious pluralism, the National Council of Churches pledges to welcome, to respect, and to cooperate as partners with those who practice other religions and hold other worldviews, and are committed to the common good, supporting their full participation in our society and equal access to its opportunities. The NCC therefore unconditionally condemns the teachings and objectives of the contemporary Christian nationalist movement. Acknowledging these challenges which we are called to address, the NCC and our member communions envision what can be built through dialogue, collaboration, and prayer, and commit to continue our work to bring justice to all people. The NCC and its member churches look forward to later this year when the Church of St. Nicholas, the only house of worship destroyed at ground zero on that day, reopens. We will join our member communion, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, as it celebrates the opening of the doors of this resurrected parish community and now national shrine to the world. As we are all children of God, we call on each other to clear the ruins of destruction, to build anew with each of us fully human and made in the image of God. In 2013, at a moment of ecumenical renewal and organizational restructure, the National Council of Churches adopted two overarching priorities for its work: mass incarceration and interreligious relations, with a focus on peace. Today, the world's many faiths play a crucial role in building peace with justice in local communities and at a global level. Interreligious relationships build bridges of understanding between peoples in an increasingly interconnected world. These connections, which include the exploring both differences and common ground, are vital as we seek to understand one another and find mutually beneficial ways to support one another. This focus on peace draws us deeper into our existing work and commitments in interreligious relations as individual member churches and together as a council. It calls us to move beyond dialogue and acts of solidarity, both of which remain valuable imperatives of interreligious relations that must continue, into active peace building with our neighbors of various faiths for our common life as religious communities, for our society and for our world. It helps us to work together ecumenically to better know one another as Christians and as neighbors in our religiously diverse context. This further enables us to set a common agenda with our partners for this work in interreligious peace building. We as Christians in the United States acknowledge our historical and continuing privilege in our society, where we have often presumed the role of host of a common table. Recognizing that this dynamic has often contributed to systemic inequality and injustice, we are called to assume a posture of humility, whereby we are both welcomed and welcoming, and to discern mutually and collaboratively a common vision of just peace with our neighbors of various faiths. Within our broader culture, we have witnessed growing divisiveness and polarization. Public and sometimes violent acts of racism, white Christian nationalism, anti-immigrant attitudes and xenophobia, along with rising incidents of anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, and other forms of religious bigotry, sometimes committed in the name of Christianity, have created an urgency for the churches and the broader culture to recognize the imperative of interreligious engagement for peacemaking, locally, nationally, and globally. We especially acknowledge the Church's complicity in stripping indigenous and enslaved peoples of their religious freedom. The deeply entrenched legacy of racism, including the current epidemic of mass incarceration, continues to plague us. As Christians, it is our responsibility to address these ills and to assert that our faith rejects injurious discourse and violent acts as wholly incompatible with Christ's teachings. For the churches, it is an imperative reflective of our belief in the Christ who greeted his disciples saying, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you," and indeed, whose entire gospel was a message of peace and justice. In this ever-changing context that the National Council of Churches has recognized the increasing necessity of interreligious engagement by continuing its long-standing Jewish and Muslim Christian dialogues, adding new dialogues with Buddhists, Hindus, and Sikhs, strengthening its participation in interreligious coalitions such as Shoulder to Shoulder, and bolstering its advocacy with interreligious partners on U.S. public policy issues. While our churches may engage individually, we have a shared commitment to doing this interreligious work ecumenically. This shared commitment is based on the Lund principle, a guiding value of the ecumenical movement, that churches should act together in all matters except those in which deep differences of conviction compel us to act separately. Friends, there are those who see the world as divided between friends and enemies, who see humanity as divided between winners and losers. There are those who see a common effort to avoid the spread of the coronavirus pandemic as the responsibility that falls upon each of us, and others who see it as a means of trampling on what they view as their freedom. The great religions of the world reject violence and extremism. The document on human fraternity asserts, "We are a witness to the greatness of faith in God that unites divided hearts and elevates the human soul. God has created us to understand one another, to cooperate with one another, and to live as brothers and sisters who love one another." The years ahead will be difficult. Global warming, disease, environmental degradation, religious conflict, and the rise of fundamentalist movements in the world's major religions, systemic racism, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, the emergence of the doctrine of preventive or preemptive war, the spread of nuclear weapons, and other major challenges face us. Nevertheless, I believe we have made progress, and we who are believers are a principal reason for that. But if our children and grandchildren will have a decent future, it will be because we together change the very direction of the world and of our nation to one committed to cooperation, justice, and peace. I am committed to that struggle, and I am grateful to be in it beside you. Thank you.
Our second panelist in this session today is our own friend, Nina Fernando. Nina currently serves as the Executive Director for Shoulder to Shoulder. Shoulder to Shoulder is known to all of you, and ISNA helped to create Shoulder to Shoulder a decade ago. So Nina came to this position last year as the executive director, but before that also she served in Shoulder to Shoulder for more than 2 years. But Nina, her experience is known, building interreligious collaboration and addressing intercultural issues. But as a practicing Catholic, Nina, definitely believe in the interreligious collaboration. So we're very happy and delighted to have you, Nina. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, ISNA, for this wonderful opportunity to share this virtual space with you all at the 2021 ISNA Convention, Reimagine and Rebuild with Renewed Resolve. My name is Nina Marie Fernando, and I am the Executive Director of the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign, Standing with American Muslims, Advancing American Ideals. Shoulder to Shoulder is a national multi-faith coalition-based campaign of religious denominations and faith-based organizations and faith communities that are committed to ending discrimination and violence against Muslims in the United States. Shoulder to Shoulder envisions an America where all people of all faiths and cultural backgrounds are treated respectfully, fairly, and with dignity. I want to share a short video with you all that tells you more about who we are and why we're here.
Hate, no matter its target, spreads like a fire, consuming us all.
Jews will not
Radical Islamists.
In 2010, anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States filled the airwaves of major media outlets.
Not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim.
If they put a mosque up right here,
Controversy raged over the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, and Florida pastor Terry Jones was threatening to publicly burn the Quran. The number of hate groups had escalated for a decade to an all-time high.
Meet today to discuss what we have considered to be a very alarming trend in a rise in anti-Muslim bigotry in this country.
In response to this new wave of Islamophobia, faith communities across the country came together to declare in one voice, an attack on one faith community is an attack on all faith communities. Since 2010, the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign has worked to form relationships, listen, learn, and work in solidarity to address the growing rise of anti-Muslim rhetoric, racism, and discrimination. Shoulder to Shoulder is a growing coalition of 34 national religious denominations, over 60 local organizations, and thousands of individual supporters across the country. We are people of different faiths, cultures, and backgrounds working alongside each other to bring about the nation we want for our children, our neighbors, and our communities. Shoulder to Shoulder equips. Shoulder to Shoulder connects.
We should take great comfort and strength in the fact that this is the kind of response we are probably going to have.
And Shoulder to Shoulder mobilizes people to take action. The problem of anti-Muslim discrimination persists today, from the harmful impacts of the Muslim ban to high levels of hate crimes and bullying.
In our country.
This work is ongoing, and Shoulder to Shoulder needs your support to continue our mission. It takes each and every one of us to build the society we long for, and we don't have to do this work alone. That's why we're here, and we hope you'll join us in the vision of Shoulder to Shoulder. To learn more about our work, become a member, and contribute, please visit shouldertoshouldercampaign.org.
I hope that video gives you a better sense and understanding about the work of Shoulder to Shoulder, who we are and why we're here. You saw in our video the 3 pillars of Shoulder to Shoulder's work. We connect, we equip, and we mobilize faith leaders of all backgrounds in the United States to be strategic partners in countering Islamophobia and discrimination and violence against Muslims. I now want to share a few words about my own story and why I'm here doing this work. Once again, my name is Nina Marie Fernando, and I am Shoulder to Shoulder's Executive Director. I was born and raised in Southern California in a Sri Lankan Catholic family. I grew up with a strong sense of faith. I went to Catholic school, and our family went to Catholic Mass every week, sometimes more. I sang in multiple choirs and eventually became a cantor, leading music at Mass. As a young adult, I was inspired by the example and writings of St. Francis and also of liberation theologies. My father, who is now retired, is an engineer. One evening, I was home visiting from college, and my father invited his supervisor over, Ali, for dinner. Ali happened to be Muslim and also an imam. Imam Ali was curious to know what I was interested in studying, and when I told him I was interested in religion and social justice, his eyes lit up. He told me that his Muslim faith compelled him to get involved in social justice and social change. He asked me about my Catholic faith and about my values, and he told me about his, from his Muslim faith and his values. And he told me about a number of incredible interfaith organizations and fellowships where I could explore my own faith at the intersection of social justice. That one conversation with Imam Ali led me on a path that opened up my world. After that, I decided to study social change through music and religious studies in college, and I went on to complete my master's degree in interreligious and intercultural engagement. I went on the fellowship he suggested, and I met the man that would eventually become my husband there. I worked as a faith-rooted organizer with a social justice organization in Los Angeles. I learned about the interreligious conflict and coexistence in Sri Lanka, and eventually found myself here back home in the United States, now serving at the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign for the past 4 years. All that from one conversation with a Muslim, compelled by his faith, compelling me in my Catholic faith to seek justice for our shared communities. Our society today is an incredibly divided, fueled by siloed communities, us versus them narratives, and media echo chambers. During the last several years, America has become more polarized than any other time in recent memory, a condition amplified by the events and tensions of the recent months, and ever more so now, even in the lead up to the 20th commemoration of 9/11. I'm convinced that faith can be a uniting and transformative force on this issue, and so much more. When Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and people of other faiths and backgrounds come together, we can make a profound impact on one another and on our society. One wonderful example of our work is that every Ramadan, Shoulder to Shoulder uplifts opportunities for folks to get to know their Muslim neighbors. In years past, we populated a nationwide listing of iftars open to interfaith guests across the nation. In 2009, we mapped over 530 iftars open to guests of other faiths and none in 38 states. And we know there were far more than what we could capture. In the last 2 years, because of the pandemic, we started what we called our Welcome to My Table initiative, where we paired households to one another to connect during Ramadan. We loved hearing about the simple and profound stories of connection, like how 2 preteens in different households discussed video game favorites, or how 2 households shared recipes in advance so they could enjoy the same meal on the night they met virtually. We know that supporting deeper relationships must be joined by pushing back against Islamophobia. We have held trainings both in person and now virtually across the country, training hundreds of religious leaders, teachers, chaplains, and everyday people to understand and effectively push back against Islamophobia, anti-Muslim discrimination, and violence. We show them proven messaging and strategies that change hearts and minds to strengthen local multi-religious networks. The theme for this year's ISNA convention is reimagine and rebuild with renewed resolve. And as I close my remarks, I invite you to renew your resolve and your faith in building a nation that lives up to its ideals. I invite you to reimagine a society where people are all treated equitably with dignity and respect, no matter their faith or cultural background, or the color of their skin, or the language they speak, or how they pray. What would that society, what would our country look and feel like? That is the vision of Shoulder to Shoulder. We hope you'll join us. To learn more about our work and to sustain it, visit shouldertoshouldercampaign.org. Thank you, ISNA, for being a founding member of Shoulder to Shoulder and an ardent supporter of our work and vision.
Now it is my pleasure to introduce my good friend and one of our own community member, Suhail Khan. Suhail currently serves as the senior fellow at the Institute of Global Engagement, but Suhail also as the director of external relations for Microsoft here in the Washington office. But Suhail is known in our community. His service to our nation in many administrations, including Bush administration and others, as well as he worked at the Hill as well. But he's also known with his work at the interreligious communities and relationship with the interreligious communities, particularly with the Jewish communities, and he made a number of new initiatives through these collaborations. But I have to also talk about the commitment of Suhail Khan family as well to serve the Muslim community. So Suhail, welcome, and please your presentation. The floor is yours.
Greetings. My name is Suhail Khan, and I serve as a senior fellow at the Institute for Global Engagement, a think tank dedicated to promoting religious freedom for all people of all faiths. I'm really honored to be part of this discussion today. I know it's virtual. I'd rather be with everybody in person, but hopefully we'll make the best of it in a virtual setting. And I'm especially grateful for the other panelists that are joining this session, including my good friend Rabbi David Saperstein. This session, as you know, is entitled Collaboration Between Faith Communities for the Common Good and Nurturing Compassionate Through Interfaith Work. This is needed more than ever at this time of division, of hatred, and increasingly, unfortunately, violence that's being directed towards people of faith, particularly religious minorities. We saw recently the spate of attacks on mosques and Islamic centers. There was the attack on the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and we're seeing churches who have been attacked and people have been hurt and even killed in these horrific instances of violence. And more than ever, it's needed for people of goodwill from all religious communities to come together to combat this unfortunate misunderstanding that often leads to not only hatred, but also, as I said, violence and even death for innocents around our country. I came to this work in a very roundabout way. I came to Washington, D.C. in the 90s as a young attorney to serve on Capitol Hill. Like a lot of people who come to Capitol Hill, I specifically came to work on legislation that I hoped would better my country and better the world. I helped a congressman from the San Francisco Bay Area on his election campaign. He won, and he brought me out to Washington, D.C. to serve on Capitol Hill as his legal advisor and subsequently as his communications director. And it was there that I began to see that legislation, particularly legislation that was related to the civil rights of various ethnic and religious minorities around the country, was often being considered without any consideration or any voice from the very communities that would be disproportionately affected by that legislation. Specifically, when I came to Washington, D.C., it was in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, and there was legislation proposed by the then Clinton administration to enhance the powers of law enforcement, particularly the FBI. And it was very clear to me that that legislation would, in fact, have very negative ramifications when it came to the civil rights and civil liberties of the Muslim, Arab American, and South Asian communities, not to mention other Americans in our country. And so right away, it became very important to not only voice opposition to particular provisions in that bill, but to build coalitions, cross-party, Republican and Democrat, cross-regional, West Coast, East Coast, Southern, Midwestern, rural, and urban coalitions, but also religious coalitions to bring people of various religious backgrounds, particularly because those religious communities, as I stated earlier, would be negatively impacted by the legislation, to come and have a seat at the table. As is often said in Washington, D.C., if you're not at the table, you're often on the menu. And that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of describing how legislation can, in fact, negatively impact various communities, and oftentimes those communities are not present for drafting and passage of that very legislation. At the time, and unfortunately even to this day, it was very clear to me that the American Muslim political institutions were very weak and did not have the political strength or heft that was needed to really actively and effectively make the political case on Capitol Hill. And what was needed, in fact, was for those young organizations to join with our Christian, Jewish, and other friends from other faith communities, other civil rights communities, to come together in a coalition to effectively voice the concerns that all of us shared when it came to, in this case, the 1995 Counterterrorism Act. This story has been repeated time and time again. We saw the same challenges with the passage of the Patriot Act post 9/11, after the horrific attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. I served in the White House for President Bush during both terms and was there for those horrific attacks. I shared, like my fellow Americans, the desire to go after those who had hurt so many of my fellow Americans, but likewise was concerned that we do so in a thoughtful and surgical manner, and not one that would negatively impact innocent Americans across our country. And as we saw, there was several overstepping that was initiated and engaged by law enforcement. And again, it was clear to me that not only did the South Asian, Muslim American, Arab American, and other communities who were so negatively impacted by that legislation need a seat at the table, but that they needed to do that in coalition with our friends of various communities in order to effectuate positive and widespread change. This became much more obvious, as I stated, in my time in the administration. And it was at that time that I, on a much more cohesive and much more concerted way, began working with Jewish and American civil liberty and civil rights organizations around the country, building relationships, building partnerships, to join in coalition, to work on various issues related to civil rights, to humanitarian issues around the globe, and so many challenges that we continue to face in our very broken world. There were two very unique examples of bipartisan, cross-party, cross-religious, and even cross-cultural success that was had in the most recent years through the formation of what is called the Muslim-Jewish Advisory Council, which was stood up by both the American Jewish Committee and ISNA just over 5 years ago. And that organization, MJAC as it's called, Muslim Jewish Advisory Committee, was stood up to really focus in two specific areas. One, to combat anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bigotry, and secondly, to promote a positive image of Jewish Americans and Muslim Americans to the larger public. So in the first regard, we focused on legislation in the 2017 and 2018 time period that would include and amend the 1996 bill that was passed in the wake of several horrific church bombings, particularly of bombings of African American churches in particular states. And that bill increased the penalties for those violent acts in 1996. And several members of Congress, including Congressman Kutzoff, a Republican from Tennessee, and a congressman from Washington State, whose name is just now escaping me, and then Senator Dianne Feinstein from California, and Senator Orrin Hatch, a Republican from Utah, came together to enhance the penalties for those who engaged in hate crimes against synagogues, mosques, Islamic schools, and other Jewish and Muslim cultural centers. That bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, both in the House and Senate, and in October of 2018, President Trump signed that bill into law. And that was another example of the Jewish and the Muslim communities coming together, working together on a shared challenge of hate crimes, of violence, particularly against institutions, mosques, synagogues, schools, Islamic centers around the country. And we were able to get that legislation introduced and passed in both chambers and signed into law by the president in very rapid time. And I would dare say that had the individual communities attempted to do that work on their own, there would not have been the tremendous success that we had as a Jewish-Muslim coalition. So that was a very early example of why it was so important that, in this case, the Jewish and the Muslim communities came together. Again, we introduced legislation in 2020 to bring the resources to the federal authorities, particularly at the Department of Justice, to assist the state and local law enforcement agencies when it came to tracking and compiling the numbers and the data and the statistics when it came to hate crimes directed towards religious communities, including the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities across our country. That bill, the Jabara Hate Act, was passed in April of 2021, again with overwhelming bipartisan support both in the House and the Senate, and signed into law by President Joe Biden. And so, again, another example of working together with amazing legislative and political results. These two instances really underscore the need for our communities to work together. In a similar vein, I've done important work working in partnership with the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities on issues, particularly with the Christian communities working on international challenges, including in Iraq, in Syria prior to the Civil War, in Nigeria, where we know there are often challenges between the Christian and the Muslim populations there, in Europe, in assisting Muslim and Jewish minorities in Europe. Again, there it's crucial that we work in partnership with organizations of different faith backgrounds. Rabbi David Saperstein, who is a fellow co-panelist in this session, has been a partner, a tremendous partner in that regard, both in his private capacity, serving on the MJAC as I described, but also in his government capacity. As you will know from his introduction, he served very proudly and with great success as the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom, where on behalf of the United States, he was in some of the most difficult places around the globe, promoting religious freedom, not only for the Jewish community or the Christian community, but often for the Muslim community. He and I had the honor of traveling together, or I should say I had the honor to travel with him and Imam Majid and other prominent leaders to the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, to go visit the refugee camps of the Rohingya. We were tasked to go investigate that tragedy and bring back information to our civil society partners, but also to our government leaders on Capitol Hill at the State Department to convey the tragedy there, the scope of the tragedy, the numbers of people that were pushed out of their homes in Myanmar into refugee camps in Bangladesh, and what the United States, working with our international partners, should do in response to that ongoing challenge. So this is just another example of some of the work that American Muslims working with our partners, the Jewish American and Christian American communities, and others from the Hindu and Sikh and Buddhist and other faith traditions have done together to promote religious freedom. Again, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to spend time with you and to share some of my thoughts. I'll end on a note of concern, and that there are some within our community who are concerned, particularly with the work that the Muslim community is doing with some of our Jewish American partners. And I know that there are very strong and passionate feelings when it comes to what is happening in Israel and in Palestine, particularly in the occupied territories and the ongoing challenges there of the occupation. But what I will say is that it is crucial now more than ever, because of the conflict and the long standing nature of the conflict and the constant violence that we see, and of course the number of civilians that unfortunately lose their lives, innocent civilians that lose their lives in these conflicts, for people of goodwill to come together based on principle to work together in our shared tradition of bridge building, of peace building, and one of trying to reconcile. One of the things I've learned working in the political arena is that oftentimes when we meet a member of Congress or a senator or even a president, we think these are leaders. And yes, by their classic definition, they are leaders. But what I find is so crucial is that we build capacity behind or in support of those leaders for positive change, for peace building, for reconciliation. And that capacity building is in the hands of all of us. And just as we each have a vote when it comes to our political leaders, we also have a vote when it comes to trying and working towards that bridge building, that capacity, so that we can bring, as it were, the Amen chorus that will help and support political leaders when they do take risks for peace, when they do reach across the aisle, when they try to build a more understanding and a more compassionate country and a more compassionate world, that there is a group of individuals of various faith backgrounds inspired by their respective faith traditions, who are supporting those political leaders in those brave moves towards positive change, towards peace, towards reconciliation, and ultimate healing of broken communities, both here in the United States and around the globe. So I want to end on that cautionary note that people have concerns, but I would argue that those concerns we should negotiate, but we should proceed in a very thoughtful and meaningful and principled manner so that we can continue to effectuate change. We know that this was the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and that is what is successful, I see, in my life in the political arena. It's reaching across the aisle, reaching across the table, and with an open hand of friendship to work towards peace, to work towards healing, understanding, and reconciliation. So again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you, some of the successes that we've had, some of the challenges that we continue to face as we continue to try to bring healing to our broken world. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you in person, God willing, in the near future. Take care.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend, Rabbi Ambassador David Saperstein. David is really known to all of you. David currently serves as the Director Emeritus of the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism, the largest Jewish movement in the United States. But before that, David also served as our ambassador at large for international religious freedom. But David is known for his commitment to build interreligious relations and partnership. So, David, welcome to ISNA Convention, and the floor is yours.
What an honor and a pleasure it is to have the opportunity to speak once again to the ISNA conference, and that I am doing so with two of my closest colleagues and dear friends, Imam Majid and Jim Winkler, who plays such an influential and respected role in interfaith relations within the United States and across the globe, makes this especially sweet for me. We've been asked to reflect on the state of interreligious affairs and its impact on the work, the common work that we are striving to do in the United States and around the world. So let me just begin with some general observations. We live in an extraordinary moment in human history. We have seen, after a long, sustained period in the post-World War II era of growth of democracy and human rights across the globe, in the last 10 to 15 years, significant retrenchment, which has escalated in the last few years. The growth of autocracy, the weakening of human rights, the weakening of religious freedom, the weakening of democratic structures, the rule of law, all in too many places across the globe. And in the face of that, we know that one of the most effective antidotes to message of injustice, to structural racial, gender, ethnic, legal, and economic injustice and inequities that flourish in too many places, taking such a human toll, that one of the most effective antidotes to this is the power and effectiveness of the interfaith communities of the world in working together. You know that power. You know it in your local community work. You know it in the work that you are doing on the national level and the international level, and ISNA plays an important role in that work. For when we act together effectively, it can be a geometric increase in what we can do singly. In our engagement and openness to learn and to hear each other, we enrich ourselves not only in learning about the other, including those with whom our lack of understanding has too long bred mistrust and alienation, but paradoxically in our exchanges where we must explain clearly our own traditions to others and our own views on issues to others, and test our long-held assumptions by the new perspectives we encounter in others, we deepen and sharpen our understanding of our own faith traditions as well. And in our setbacks and our achievements together, we learn invaluable lessons that can guide our communities and our nations as they struggle to become more just, more compassionate, more tolerant, more free. that is the work that we do together in so many issues across the globe. Just look at a quick snapshot at just a handful of key ones right now. The COVID crisis. So often the religious community is at the forefront of supporting and ministering to those who have been afflicted with COVID in this pandemic across the globe. So often our religious hospitals are providing health care. So often the religious communities can play a key role in helping to increase the number of vaccination sites, to help confront vaccine hesitancy, to ensure vaccine equity, that those who are being most afflicted by the disease and those who have been most left out of general health care, as well as the provision of vaccines in the COVID crisis. That includes minority communities in this country, indigenous communities in this country, and across the globe. So often it is the poor who are left behind. The religious voice is crucially important in advocating for equity in the way this pandemic is addressed and the way that vaccines are provided. The three of us have been involved in a project called Vaccines for Faith more recently, and it has involved the Abrahamic communities, the Jewish community, a wide range of Christian groups, and key Muslim groups as well, in trying to address these three issues of vaccine equity, vaccine hesitancy, and houses of worship being effective sites to provide vaccines, working very closely with the White House silo on vaccines, with the CDC and the NIH in terms of being effective in doing the work that we are doing here, or addressing sustainable development goals across the world, addressing poverty across the world, or speaking out for the protection of God's creation at a crucial moment when we're confronting the global crisis of global climate change and the devastating impact that it is having and can potentially have far more destructively for generations yet to come if we don't protect God's creation for all of God's children. So this is a key part of our work together. But let me just focus on the issue of religious freedom and international religious freedom. Here in the United States, we have some tensions that divide some in the religious and civil rights communities. When do religious individuals and groups and institutions have a right to refrain from providing full civil rights to protected groups because it violates their religious conscience? Or when does the civil rights claim rise to the levels of such a compelling interest for the state that the state has not only the right but the obligation to restrain religious objections to that and not to allow them to be honored? If someone doesn't like Muslims, do they have a right to use government funding or to discriminate in public accommodations with signs saying no Muslims allowed, no Jews allowed, no Catholics or Hindus or atheists allowed? In the main, we object to that kind of approach. And yet we know that there are times, particularly when we're dealing with gender and with sexual orientation and gender identity, that people do have conscientious religious objections to fully accommodating the civil rights of people. How do we balance those out? Crucial issues. I think we can help model greater understanding of the values on both sides and help lead the way in looking for compromises and common ground where we can advance further without adding to the divisiveness in American society. But on the international level, I pray for the day that will be the kind of dispute, form of religious infringement on religious freedom that the world is grappling with. Because on a global level, we know from the Pew polls that nearly 80% of the population of the world lives in countries that have systemic, widespread restrictions on religious freedom, either emanating from the state or emanating from social forces in that country. Fortunately, 3/4 of the countries of the world are free of that kind of religious persecution. But some of the most populous, from China to India to Pakistan to Nigeria. You can go down the list of highly populated countries that have serious restraints on religious freedom. And that is a central challenge for all of us. For those of us in the Jewish community who have been the quintessential victims of religious persecution over 3 millennia now, issues of religious freedom are crucially important, not just because they affect us. We live at a time when Jews are, despite the rise in anti-Semitism, are genuinely, in the wake of the Holocaust, offered more tolerance, respect, commitment to the freedom than most. But on a global level, we see minority groups particularly being persecuted almost everywhere. And that is a serious threat, and no people in good conscience, including my community, can afford to remain silent in the face of such persecution. In particular, the Jewish community has been outspokenly supportive of the Rohingya community, nearly 1 million people who have been ethnically cleansed from Burma, living in dire straits in Bangladesh that is overwhelmed in its ability to provide what they hoped would be temporary housing for this segment of the Muslim community. We Jews know what it is like to be ethnically cleansed. We have been exiled and banished from community after community because of suspicions and hatred and group hatred. It has been a terrible aspect of the plight of Jews over the centuries. We can't stand in silence now. And with the Uyghur Muslims in China, the Jewish community, again, has been particularly outspoken, and I'm very proud of that. This is a form of cultural genocide, of actions that meet the definition of genocide in international definitions, with imposed sterilization on women, efforts to really hold down the birth rate of the Uyghur community, just as some of the restrictions on birth rates in general in China are being raised for the general, lifted for the general population. So the fact that now there is such restrictions, such effort to destroy the culture of the Uyghur community, so many people rounded up and put into work camp forms of concentration camps, the brutalization that of the reports from the reports we're hearing that is taking place there, no one of good conscience can remain silent. And they are not the only ones in China or elsewhere. Tibetan Buddhists are subject to cultural genocide in that country as well. And in so many countries, minorities face these kinds of restraints. We need to speak out. If good people in religious communities that are free enough to do it do not speak out whenever any minority group in that country, whether it is the minorities of Muslims in those countries or Jews in those countries or Christians in those countries or Hindus or Buddhists or atheists in those countries, no one should remain silent as we see this kind of oppression continue. And I'm very proud of the coalitions that the Muslim and Christian and Jewish communities have put together, sometimes with broader coalitions, to speak out for justice across the globe, for all of those to be able to live with their peaceful practices of religion as God sees them to practice their religion, as inspire them to see how to practice their religion in accordance with their religious conscience. This is a central crisis we face, and working together needs to be a central part of the work that we do at this vital moment. We face problems in the United States where we've also seen, as we have in Europe and other places, the rise of Islamophobia, the rise of anti-Semitism. Jews and then Muslims are the number 1 and 2 group in America who are subject to hate crimes on a religious basis in this country. Although, as I think you know, African Americans face hate crimes at an even much higher level on a racial basis. We're in this together. The rise of hate in this country has been something extraordinary, and the violent form that it has taken has been something extraordinary. We've witnessed the explosion of hate groups, mostly on the right, sometimes on the left, and of hate acts that target Muslims and Jews and Sikhs and gays and women in escalating numbers. we have witnessed the degradation of civil discourse in America, first in the dark corners of the internet, and then more publicly, exacerbated by the anonymity of social media and the stamp of approval of such rhetoric by too many leaders in our nation. As Dr. King said in the wake of the Birmingham church bombing, that those 4 girls who perished have something to say to every politician who has fed his constituents with the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produces the murderer. What transpired at Tree of Life was the most brutal, deadly anti-Semitic attack in the history of America. But no group is safe. No group will be free of hate crimes. If any group can be targeted, we are indeed all in this together. So in the face of shootings in black churches and at a Sikh temple, arsons in mosques, desecrations of Jewish cemeteries, swastikas painted on synagogues, we must respond together. And we do this work because in the face of the surge in hate speech and hate crimes in America, we recognize that they are linked. Hate speech, bigoted speech, racist speech, discourse that demeans, that demonizes, that depicts those with whom we differ as the enemy, the other, as evil, as a danger to our nation. Such violent rhetoric too often can spur violent action. Then the damage that such hate crimes inflict on their victims and on America can be great and requires a national response. And the religious communities must be at the forefront of that response. For hate crimes are more than mere acts of violence. They are more than murders and beatings and arsons and desecrations. Hate crimes are nothing less than attacks on the values that are the pillars of our republic and the guarantors of our freedom. They are a betrayal of the promise of America. They erode our national well-being. Those who commit these crimes do so fully intending to tear at the too often frayed threads of diversity that binds America together and make us strong. They seek to divide and conquer. They seek to tear us apart from within, pitting American against American, fomenting violence in civil society. What has been so extraordinary is how the religious communities of America have arisen to come together after such tragedies have occurred. Muslims cleaning up desecrated Jewish cemeteries in St. Louis and Philadelphia. The president of a McClellan, Texas synagogue handing a set of keys to the synagogue to the imam of a mosque that had been burned to the ground. Cleaning up graffiti and vandalism. Entire communities of Pittsburgh and Poway where the synagogues were attacked, as was the case at Mother Emanuel Church and so many other places, standing in solidarity with the Jewish community so tragically victimized. All of this working in broad-based interfaith coalitions that are a hallmark of America to delegitimize hate acts and hate speech. And indeed, when people come together across political, religious, cultural lines to build together a better America for all, we are modeling the very kind of America we hope to create. And we look to all our political, religious, cultural, and civic leaders to help in achieving this. In the last year, we've seen just the slightest diminution of acts of violence against Muslims and against Jews, mostly because COVID has put many people in their homes and has cut down on public life in America in general. But on the internet, we've seen a significant increase in hate speech and hate harassment targeting Muslims and Jews and so many others in this country. And we need to address that. We need to stand together on the principle that we may be a religiously and ethnically and racially diverse nation, but we will remain united, e pluribus unum, out of many one, as one of the symbols of America has said. So these are some of these structures. We know sometimes it's hard. We differ over very important things in our communities. In the last months, we've seen some of those divisions over how to think about the what's happened in the conflict between Israel and Palestinians, particularly Gaza and Israel. This is a very painful dilemma. I think many of us share the hope that there can be a two-state solution, that the Palestinian people are entitled to the full appreciation and implementation of their national dreams, their national hopes, to have a viable state for their people. And the Jewish people are absolutely committed to be able to live safely in a country that represents the 3,000-year-old dream of the Jewish people, where there have been Jews in the presence in the Holy Land of Israel and Palestine throughout all of history. And the right to the Jewish people to have fulfillment of their expression of nationalism in their historic homeland also needs to be ensured and protected. This requires compromise. This requires working together, and I hope that we can model that. What is important, however, is that attacks of Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, physical attacks or hate attacks against either community based on those political differences should never be met with silence by either of our communities. We saw some of that happen recently in Los Angeles and other countries where Jews were singled out during the time of the conflict between Gaza and Israel. We can differ over how to evaluate that conflict. We ought to stand together that no one should be targeted because they're a Muslim, because they're a Jew here over that issue in this country, and act to protect each other. So this is a significant agenda that we share in common here, how to navigate these ideas in a way that can heal America, in a way that can transcend divisions that threaten to tear America apart. We must model what America can be, and we must help lead the way to create a nation in a world in which every child of God is able to grow up in a land of freedom, a land of peace, a land in which they can live out their lives in accordance with the peaceful practices of their religious conscience, and work together to ensure that that is the destiny, the treasure, the bequest of every single child on earth. I look forward to the continued opportunity to work with all of you for many years to come. Thank you for what you do. Let's go forward together.
So thank you so much. I would like to thank all our panel here today for their remarkable presentations. They gave you just really a highlight of what we have accomplished together. You heard Jim Winkler talk about the National Council of Churches, and he talked about how the NCC is working closely with ISNA for a number of decades. He talked about a number of programs that we have done together to advocate for those who are in need. You also heard Nina Fernandez about Shoulder to Shoulder, and you heard about her own personal story. Nina, as a committed Catholic, practicing Catholic, and she came to Shoulder as executive director, believing that we have to work together at the interfaith communities. An attack in one community is attack on all of us. Now, today, Shoulder to Shoulder is grown to be a national movement. So we're very delighted to have you, Nina. And you also heard from Suhail Khan. Suhail, as I mentioned earlier in my introduction to him, he has been a pioneer in the interreligious collaboration and advancing interreligious relations in the United States, particularly with our Jewish friends. He a founding member of MJAC, Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, which made significant progress and strides in the past few years. And Suhail highlighted some of these national legislations that were signed by the president to protect our communities and to address issues of hate speech and hate crimes. So Suhail, thank you so much for your contribution today. And lastly, I would like to thank you, Rabbi David Saperstein, for your remarkable address as well. And you said it right, Rabbi Saperstein, that we have to work together. And the Jewish community, we know that went through difficult circumstances in the past, more than 3,000 years. And today we have to work together. Attacking any one community is an attack on all of us. So thank you, Rabbi Saperstein, for your courage and for your guidance and your commitment to building interreligious relations. ISNA is really delighted and to have friends like all of you in this panel. With that, I would like to conclude this session, and hopefully we will meet in person next year, of course, pandemic permitting, to have an in-person convention. Thank you again for listening for today's session, and hope our interreligious relationship will only grow. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Welcome to the 58th Annual ISNA Convention. Reimagine and rebuild with renewed resolve.